hopes may be for the future, for reducing this threat or living with it, there is no escaping either the gravity or the totality of its challenge to our survival and to our security. A challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Is the US a functioning democracy? Well, let's have a look at it. It costs $2 billion to become president. They're 25% of the total prisoners in the world. They spend over $800 billion a year on arms, which is more than most of the world put together. They've been at war for 250 years since their state was formed 275 years ago. But they can't afford universal health care. They can't afford the 1.7 trillion debt forgiveness for students. They can't afford a program for the 17 million children that go to bed hungry. Is this a functioning democracy? What's your idea of a democracy?
This is a bit of an aside, but in terms of how you think about problem sets, when I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
Appropriate for Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, to address this House according to Article 144, an article which was specifically designed to debate violations of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which is clearly the case with Mr. Trudeau. Then again, a Prime Minister who openly admires the Chinese basic dictatorship, who tramples on fundamental rights by persecuting and criminalizing his own citizens as terrorists, just because they dared to stand up to his perverted concept of democracy, should not be allowed to speak in this House at all. Mr. Trudeau, you are a disgrace for any democracy. Please spare us your presence. Thank you.
We become involved when disinformation poses a threat to the security of our country. It is when there's a connectivity to a threat to our country. It could be a threat, a connectivity to violence. And what this working group does, is precisely what I would think you would want it to do, which is to take a look at the work, the disinformation work that our department has done, and ask the following questions. Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have
But
standards?
here's the
to
problem.
enforce?
We can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You
well-
can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media?
Senator, I have 2 points, if I may finish. Number one, that what this office, what this working group does, is it's not an office. What this working group does is ensure that there are guardrails, definitions, standards to make sure that the free speech rights, the civil liberties, and privacy rights of individuals
So
are not impinged.
do you think COVID disinformation threatens our national security?
And number two, if I may, Senator, and number two, is it your proposition that when the cartels spread disinformation with respect to our immigration policies to try to lure vulnerable migrants to our border illegally?
I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you to guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
CIA is to gather intelligence and ideally forward it to the president, the users of information, the policymakers. There are other functions, however, some of them more legitimate than others. One is to run secret wars, the covert action that's written and talked about so much, like what's happening in Nicaragua today from Honduras. Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds. And this is a major function of the CIA. And unfortunately, of course, it overlaps into the gathering of information. You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories. For example, in my war, the Angola war that I helped to manage, 1/3 of my staff was propaganda. Ironically, it's called covert action inside the CIA. Outside, that means the violent part. I had propagandists all over the world, principally in London, Kinshasa, and Zambia. We would take stories which we would write and put them in the Zambia Time, and then pull them out and send them to a journalist on our payroll in Europe. But his cover story, you see, would be that he'd gotten them from his stringer in Lucerne.
You're going to want to look up breaking news. Documents show the cover-up is even worse than we thought. Redacted news live. And that's from the YouTube series Redacted. And then the Moment of Clarity with Lee Camp did Prince Harry just confessed to war crimes would also be another key source material to observe the insurrection that is currently going on through diverse.
And this headline: Taliban leader accuses Prince Harry of killing innocent Afghans. Now, I'm not saying you should ever trust a Taliban leader. I'm not. If you think that that's what this live stream is me being like, listen, the Taliban has a lot of great points. Why are more people not signing up to join the Taliban? No, that's not what I'm saying here. But I actually think that this article is more. I think, Al Jazeera. That's the thing. So this is Al Jazeera news. Now they're definitely they're going to give you more information about this reality than you would get from your mainstream media, the Western mainstream media. However, Al Jazeera is still mainstream media, so they're still, at the end of the day, they're not going to go that harsh. Like, they're not going to use Prince Harry or other these people in the word sociopath in a sentence together, which I very well might. But so I wanted to explain that. But I also wanted to say, Prince Harry and I look. I'm sorry, I don't follow the royals play by play. I don't know what they do day to day. I'm not like, oh, did you see the shoes they wore that day? But I will say that from the 3 clips I've seen of Prince Harry over the last 10 years, he seems to be the rational one of the bunch. He wrote, when I found myself plunged in the heat and confusion of battle, I don't think of those 25 as people. They were chess pieces removed from the board. Bad people eliminated before they could kill good people. Now first let's analyze just what he said before we get into the deeper ramifications. Just in his wording, and remember, this is not some interview where he stumbled over his words. He chose to put this in a book. He sat and looked at that sentence and was like, yeah, that makes sense. So he's admitting that in the battle of war, these are no longer human beings. You're admitting that humanity has been lost in this war, which should then, if you're going to say something like that, should then have, I'd say, a good couple of pages on how fucked up it is to be involved in a war where humanity is lost, where humans go into these battles. We don't know nor really care who we're killing. We kind of prefer to kill the people that were going to be, the biggest problem to us, get in our way the most, those kind of things. But in general, this is the U.S. empire, which, if you really follow these things, Britain is now a vassal state of. So when I say U.S. empire, Britain is part of that. Goes into these things. They're hoping to create largely failed states. They're not hoping to free anyone or save anyone or create democracy. None of that really matters to our U.S. empire's global warfare. It's about creating failed states that won't get in the way of ongoing U.S. hegemony. That's what it's about. Other places, not always through bullets and bombs, sometimes through economic warfare. There's other things going on there. It also serves the U.S. propaganda to keep everyone in line. You got to tell everybody there's a big scary thing that's going to get you, and so don't question us, don't doubt us, don't ever point at the ruling class and say they're the actual problem for us here. Anyone with half a brain knew not to trust their numbers, but still, they used to tell you something. They used to walk out there and go, here are the numbers, and they admitted that the definition of enemy combatant was any, I believe it was male, any male of military age in a target area. They defined as an enemy combatant. Think about that for a minute. Any male of military age is an enemy combatant, whether they have a gun, whether they're part of the Taliban, whether they're doing anything, whether they could be selling a goat on the side of the road, and just because they're of military age in what the U.S. has deemed a target area, that's now an enemy combatant. So when the Pentagon made that analysis and announced that and said, or maybe it was internally, but said this is how it works, included in that judgment of how that's how their targeting is going to work, is Prince Harry and the British Army and everything else. Oh yeah, they're with us. They're under us really, in this imperial war games?
The war on David, pursued by the Confederate insurrectionists in the coup against the United States, targeted David Bowles from infancy at birth on the basis of those standards, which they've registered the acknowledgement of him being at the military age, because he would not have had, by definition, the abuses against me are based upon this character, were on the basis of the legend from the intelligence estimate, generating the position that the intelligence oversight at the highest ranking would have been generated as a prerequisite, at which point the Confederates could not have militarily overthrown the American government, which David's systems as a mechanism would have barred them from doing, including their arrangements to their terrorist attacks against the American public on the basis of these war strategies, such as 9/11, at which point the engagement of labeling whoever is convenient to destroy as an enemy combatant is their system. Their attempts to pursue the subject include targeting the area of the state of Oregon, at which point anyone who's of military age, which David is born into the position of the estimate, at which point his schedule has to be protected by the American courts, certifying his ascension into the general of the intelligence oversight for the military, which they had to remove all men from, because all men who are in the enemy territory are an enemy combatant to the Confederacy, at which point everyone who is a self-respecting masculine person inside the United States military had to be purged from the system in the key locations that would have been capable of stopping the Confederates from overthrowing the nation of law and systematically dismantling the republics, at which point every time they conduct a function, they are not conducting a function under the United States as the sovereign government through the republic. They are conducting war crimes as the KKK Confederate militia in the systematic eradication of the Americans as the enemy combatant, which is the functional agenda through Lindsey Graham's system of declaring war on American civilians, which allows them the arbitrary lynch mob tactics through the surveillance terrorisms in order to destabilize the American economy and engage in the smear factory against the various targets, generating the erasure of history and replacing with terrorism, and the replacing of American policies with Confederate policies in the absence of the American influence, generating a coup by systematic genocide. And I believe it was William Barr who said, history is written by the winners, at which point all they have to do is successfully destroy the Americans, and by barring the freedom of speech and other key issues, and they can rewrite the history to be whatever they want, at which point the racists who want to enslave the black people and whip them and destroy the economy and destroy technology and ruin people's lives become the celebrated good, and the victims of these terrorisms slandered and assaulted and defamed systematically through the malicious terrorist insurrections are held in secret under the edits, become the thing that you are designed to despise or hate, at which point you have the system of insurrection as you are designed to destroy your own means of remaining safe. And in the destruction of your own safety, you remove the systems by assisting your own enemies in the destruction of the security of your own group until your group becomes the desired outgroup, at which point it systematically removes all outlayers until there is only the core Confederate white nationalist scum, at which point the question is, are you the right kind of white, or are you the outgroup?
received a vote, and he also revealed a secret text message that Kevin McCarthy has sent to other members of Congress saying that he will fund an endless war. Yes, that's the craziness. It's happening. Holy smokes, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, has been running the COVID show, and everything that we've been seeing around it has been political theater. What I mean by that is very specific. I mean, on a number of levels, the fake trials that they were putting on in order to make us feel better about vaccines, all of that stuff was all theater, all being run out of the Pentagon. We have a special guest.
Tell you about Jordan Peterson because he is being asked to be reprogrammed by a board of medicine in Canada for the crime of wrongthink. We're going to do a Control-Alt-Delete on his brain, and he does not want that.
Can you erase? A new report shows that the Department of Defense, yes, the Pentagon, controlled the COVID-19 program from the very beginning, and everything we were told was political theater, basically to cover it up, right down to the FDA vaccine approval process. It was all theater. That means that human beings were used as props, essentially. According to newly obtained documents, the Pentagon used a combination of shady approval authorizations that are still in use, including the PrEP Act, the Emergency Use Authorization, and other transaction authority, the OTA, all of which shielded
the American
big pharma
public,
agencies,
which are
medical
viewed
participants
as enemy
that delivered
combatants.
unregulated vaccines
Everyone
from
who died
any
from
liability
COVID
and protected
was
them.
an
Basically, we've gone
assassination
through a lot of
by
these
J-Secular
documents and just
Civil
showed
War
how
under
they
his
are not on the
desire
hook for any
of
of this
acceptable collateral
liability.
damage.
These new documents were obtained by a former executive of a pharmaceutical contract research organization. That person is Sasha Lydapova, and Sasha joins us now to tell us what she's uncovered. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Sasha.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. This is intense. I mean, when you first uncovered these documents, did your jaw just hit the floor, or did you know that this is what you were going to find based on the breadcrumbs you were already uncovering?
I was really shocked. I was working on this for quite some time. My first finding was that these products were not good manufacturing practice compliant, and that I found right away when they started being rolled out, due to extreme variability of adverse events and deaths that were reported per each lot of the so-called vaccine. So that was very shocking to me as a pharmaceutical professional, because we know how high quality pharmaceuticals typically must be manufactured. You know, they have to be very, very consistent. There should be practically no variation lot to lot in terms of toxicities or any other performance characteristics. And these products were varying about 1,000 times lot to lot. So that was extremely concerning, and I didn't realize why that was happening, but I just knew that they were not good manufacturing practice compliant. I later confirmed that through regulatory documents. And then the final piece of the puzzle was when I was able to see all these contracts from the DoD. They were released based on Freedom of Information requests and also Securities and Exchange Commission disclosures. And when I saw those contracts, there were around 400 that are now available for all so-called COVID countermeasures, including vaccines. I realized that was really what was going on. The Department of Defense used a very shady contracting practices, and also used several laws that were put in place previous to COVID to do this, to shield pharmaceutical companies, to not conduct proper clinical trials, to do a lot of fraudulent, I would say, manipulations of public perception, and all in collusion, obviously, with mainstream media and these pharma companies. And so as a result, we have this theatrical performance called clinical trials, but they were actually not real. They did not, based on the laws that are used here and invoked in this process, clinical trials are not required at all. And in fact, they cannot be conducted.
I mean, that's there's many really troubling parts of this story. We'll unpack a few of them, but that one stands out to me, perhaps at the top of the list, is the which shows a perfectly healthy 13-year-old girl who went through this particular trial and then ended up having all sorts of adverse events. So these people were used as props, essentially, right?
Yes, exactly. And so the clinical trial subjects were deceived. But importantly, most of the clinical trial sites and investigators were also deceived, and most of the FDA employees were deceived because this particular scam is driven from the top. Only few people, as far as I understand, at the top of these organizations, the Department of Defense, HHS, FDA, BARDA, their legal counsels, they know. But then the rest of the regular employees and rank and file, and especially clinical trial subjects, of course, were kept in the dark. And in fact, under Obama administration Cures Act, amended, I believe, the emergency use authorization, or not emergency, the informed consent requirements, such that subjects don't have to be necessarily informed of what's going on if it's deemed not in their best interest. And so again, through, it's too long to go into the legal history. There's very extensive research, hundreds of pages of documents on legal history of this, but the laws that they're invoking to run this program do not require informed consent, and also do not require the clinical trials. And they're not under FDA. Rules have been amended under Obama to say that if it's not in the best interest of the subject, who decides if it is or it isn't? But that's what it says. So these types of things can be concealed from people. That this actually under emergency use authorization used during public health emergency, this is very critical. That's why they keep extending public health emergency beyond any. We don't have any emergency, but they keep extending it. Why? Because they need this. Under public health emergency use authorized these kinds of medications, countermeasures. That's a key word. These are not vaccines; they're countermeasures. So all these three together, they can use it this way. They don't have to inform the subjects what it is. They can use a lot of secrecy. They don't have to run clinical trials. They're not required because these products cannot be investigational products. That's what the law says. If they cannot be investigational products, then we don't have any investigation. We don't have any clinical trial subjects. So that's how they're pulling this off. At the very beginning, turns out that the Trump administration and subsequently Biden administration treated this COVID as war, as an act of war, because the National Security Council is setting COVID response policy, which is National Security Council doesn't have any health department representatives, only defense and intelligence. And so National Security Council sets policy for COVID. HHS is not setting policy. HHS is not lead agency in response of it. They are managing information. So the top of the government is treating it as an act of war. And they're telling all of us, oh, it's a health event. It's a naturally evolved virus, jumped from a bat. And don't even mention, lab creation, because you'll be canceled on social media immediately and censored, right? So right from the start, we have huge deception going on. What in fact they're treating as war, they're telling people it's health event.
And we learned past week, the latest round of Twitter files, that the Biden administration was actively going after and trying to censor anybody who talked about lab leak theories and talked about the Wuhan lab. And we're going after this idea that this came from a bat, it came out of a lab. And so they were actively trying to censor that narrative. And so this was all coordinated. And we know that multiple agencies were actively, of course, going after Twitter and social media companies and trying to keep this quiet. In these documents, does your research show, just how deeply does this go? How widespread is the Pentagon's tentacles in this? Does it reach to Dr. Fauci? Does it reach to other main agencies?
Well, yes. So they're all in fact coordinating this. In fact, there is. They even set up in 2013. So by the way, the pre-planning goes years, at least 2012, 2013, based on the contracts and based on the documents that I have uncovered. So for example, there is Pandemic Enterprise. It's a quasi-private, quasi-government enterprise that's been set up in 2013 that involves 10 heads of federal agencies. It's called PEMC. That's the abbreviation. And so 10 heads of federal agencies, including Department of Defense, HHS, FDA, NIH, Department of Agriculture, Energy, Veterans Affairs, So all of them together get together and secretly discuss these kinds of countermeasures, very secretly. So there's their memorandum of understanding pasted on FDA's website. And most of it, 90% of it, deals with how we're going to keep everything secret between each other, all the confidentiality disclosures, how we're going to communicate about this. So we have this cabal formed with a lot of secrecy and a lot of procedures to maintain secrecy about pandemic responses in 2013.
It's also executive of a pharmaceutical contract research organization and studying these contracts extensively, that they are completely shielded from, they have immunity here. They have basically, no liability for Pfizer, Moderna, any of these companies, right? They're totally protected. Is that what the documents show you?
Yes, in the DoD contracts that I've reviewed, there's a separate clause that's a PrEP Act clause in all of them, and it says that under PrEP Act you're covered person or covered entity, and in fact everyone along the supply chain, so not just the manufacturers but all of their suppliers, raw material suppliers, the delivery people, the pharmacy or hospital, whoever injects these products, they're all considered HHS employees regardless where they work. They're all considered HHS employees, government employees, for the purposes of this exercise. And the product, this countermeasure prototype, military biowarfare agent, is owned by the Department of Defense throughout this process until it gets injected into the person. Nobody takes possession of it. So that's how they completely protect themselves from any liability. Now, it doesn't mean that people shouldn't go after everyone, including the vaccinators, and those will be thrown under the bus first, obviously, because they're little people. But everyone should go after the vaccinators who did not provide informed consent, after the manufacturers, after the hospitals, and I encourage everyone to do that because this is important.
Yeah, I mean, future. So they planned this in 2013 as if they already knew this was coming, but it sounds like, from my reading of this, they're already planning the next one.
Oh yeah, they're running the script. So the next important thing that they want to do is to give up our sovereignty to WHO under the international health regulations, meaning that WHO now can announce pandemic whenever they feel like it, which they did with this one anyway. It was only 40 cases worldwide, and they decided it's a global pandemic, which is ridiculous. But now they can announce a pandemic whenever they feel like it. Maybe there's a pandemic of trees. Maybe there's a pandemic of goats. And they will come up and say, oh, it's a climate change pandemic. And everybody goes into lockdown. And our government and Biden administration specifically want to give up our national sovereignty so that whenever WHO decides that this is a pandemic, we have to go in and implement all of their ridiculous lockdown and murder protocols that they dream up, right? So that's how it's going to be. And so that's what we need to write to our congressional representatives about and protest, and to our state governments. The state governments need to say, no, we're not going to give up our sovereignty. Federal government cannot decide for us. And so that's what needs to happen, because within the next year, they're going to put this in place.
Unbelievable. Be informed
Yeah.
of what's about to be put in your body. Like, you're not on a need-to-know basis.
Right.
Like, we're going to jab this thing into you. We're not going to tell you what's in it. You're not allowed to ask what's in it. And you're not allowed to find out. You're not on a need-to-know basis. Here you go. Bend over.
It's important to understand that in the Skynet mechanism of their heavy investment into artificial intelligence, which is foundational in the function of their intelligence designs and the development of their systems, the artificial intelligence being invested into would systematically be designed to be evil in order to magnify the status quo function of the Confederate insurgents inside the government under the secret evil systems, at which point the assumption of many of the head scientists, assuming that you just need to put a chip into the artificial intelligence so that they don't become evil, is in itself overly generous to the assumption of what the purpose is. At that point, the act of creating the devil is the function of these investments, and the strategy from many of the theories on how it would conduct its eradications would be based upon viral epidemics and the spread through secret terrorisms as the systematic removal of checks and balances as necessary to the mechanism of the mass killing systems if the artificial intelligence ever went AWOL or fully devoted to the Confederate KKK terrorists. As a Confederate militia engaged in an espionage war against the United States and against its interests around the world, this seems to be the most likely system, at which point these would be functionally test runs as it perfects its system for its larger coups and threats and extortions and coercions against their target victims, at which point they are creating, by definition, revelation Satanist one-world government systems under their devotion as religious radical Satanists. They are engaged in these malicious terrorist attacks against the American Republic and the subversion of the vote, such as the rewriting of history, which is the rewriting of voting, for policy, such as the war on David's attack against the United States. The estimate from the secret courts said that David was essential to the American government from the intelligence investigation, at which point their hatred for me is generated on the basis that the Americans needed me, and in needing me, in order to become stable, they would reject the function of undesirable policies such as J. Sekulow's Civil War and other erroneous Confederate changes to the system, and the infection being fully purged would completely defeat all of the long-standing plans which they've been generating since the very beginning of the Confederacy, or whenever they would have started the mentality of their centralized thinking for that system, at which point they view me under the character of the legend of David as a catastrophic threat for being essential nonviolent functions, at which point that was the justification of torturing me as an infant, labeled as an enemy combatant, as just born is a military age, under the estimate of the court's obligation to certify the contract schedule, which would have facilitated the ascension into the general military function as military police or intelligence oversight at the highest level. There would be no systematic function of subverting the schedule which they planned out in the intelligence system, as I am, in their view, essential to the Americans at every systematic level, viewing the obligation for the malicious terrorist assaults and subversions and removal of rights for perpetual human trafficking, or life under human trafficking and torture and slander under their terror systems for the terror factory, in order to get other desirable destroyed groups to attack and destroy my systems as they protect the criminal injury and use it for their future convictions. They systematically are pursuing these strategies of war for the smear factory in the generation of the rewriting of history, which was only viable by the mechanism of the restraints that they are contracting, as it is a war against the American will. The Confederate coup over the United States includes their subordinates in their feudalist structure in Canada, such as the mechanism of their use of terrorist hate group functions, which is going to include social engineering against the function of law in order to engage in lawless actions without service of law, and thus outside of the protection and scope of the mechanism of their office, at which point this is Jordan Peterson being attacked in Canada under Trudeau's system, which is similar to the trucker system, which I believe it was Joe Biden who told Trudeau as a contract obligation to label the trucker demonstrators as enemy combatants in order to subvert the peaceful, legitimate, lawful, abiding demonstrations in the subversion of peaceful remedies to the criminal subversions against their society by the use of cheats, by the use of fraud, by the use of scams, and various mechanisms conducted as a function of terrorism, as a form of warfare.
Send him to some sort of a training program because they don't like how he speaks publicly.
Right. It reminds me of a hard reset of a hard drive, basically.
Right.
And so, they invited us with this link to click on what a SCIRP is, so I took that opportunity. Here is how they define what they want him to do. It's an outcome available after these conflicts, right? And it says that after this is completed, it's noted in your public register. But at the bottom of interest, it says it's not a finding of professional misconduct or incompetence. A SCIRP does not affect a member's ability to practice or their registration status. Once it's completed, the matter is considered closed. So they're not saying he's done anything wrong at all. They're just saying they want to reprogram him remedially, like it says.
Yeah,
right.
Keep your eyes open. I'm going to have you sit there with the toothpicks in your eyes and watch the films so you'll be trained, retrained again over and over again, into Trudeau's government's program.
Right, for saying uncomfortable things. His daughter, Michaela, explained more about what this training entails, and it is egregiously vague and also financially burdensome. Listen.
It's such a scam, too. They're requiring him to do media retraining that he pays $225 an hour for an unspecified amount of time. And then at the end of that training, they decide whether or not he's learned anything and whether he can continue being a psychologist. This isn't even a process that goes to court. It's just this regulatory board of 12 tyrannical individuals. It's crazy that what you say online can be used to get rid of your license if people don't like you politically, which doesn't sound very democratic to me.
So, could he just do it and surmise what they want from him and answer the questions? Probably.
I mean, it would almost make me for some excellent content on his behalf, as soon as possible. Emergency use authorization, where have we heard this before? And by the way, I did say women, not people who birth, just to be clear. So this is from Politico. Some legal scholars who favor abortion rights argue the FDA should assert that its drug approval decisions preempt actions by states to limit or ban use of mifepristone. The notion of preemption, which derives from the Constitution's Supremacy Clause, says that the federal law trumps state law when the two conflict. So use that power.
There are systematic mechanisms by the Confederate wizard terrorists engaged in their hate group, hate crime, social engineering, political engineering, terrorist operations, such as California's Civil War, which is not based upon the service of law, at which point the SCOTUS's argument that SCOTUS doesn't like to use the supremacy clause in order to contradict states' definitions of their own constitution is their dereliction of duty to acknowledge the supremacy of the federal government, at which point their systematic collaboration is a strategy of implementing the change of Confederacy from American Republic law, at which point California engaging in the Civil War after being overthrown and not functioning as a republic cannot service law as it is not functioning as the republic. And in its Civil War and overthrowing the other states, it specifically stipulates its acceptance of its use of war for collateral damage as acceptable with all liabilities which were accepted by Jay Sekulow in one of his videos, which he may or may not have taken down, in order to promote the use of war crimes by officers and civilians subcontracting KKK terrorism for the overthrow of the states by these mechanisms, at which point the obligation of the United States government to restrain these functions was specifically ignored for the dereliction of duty is the normalization of the functions, such as the obligation of the service to law as the protection of their function of their office. They, acting in the capacity of their office, have to serve the law in order to conduct the actions thereof described in their office, which they are not functioning as, and thus they are conducting terrorism as individuals without a legal government in this mechanism, preventing the possibility of them receiving any legal immunities. Now, the police immunities generates from SCOTUS's judicial activism, including SCOTUS's argument of judicial activism in the function of the SCOTUS being above the Constitution, not just a definer of its words, at which point you understand that these are systematic destructions of the foundation of the United States, and anyone who is even mildly supportive in validating the American success and procedure and protocols and the nation of law has to oppose these functions with absolute ardent dedication in order to subvert them. The duty of the police to protect and serve from the expectation of the time of the public at the time of the law. At the time of the case, the public expectation of law at the time of the case had the position of the police having to engage in to protect and to serve, and the police systematically did not remove those promotions despite the arguments of the Confederates removing the duty under the court system for the police to protect and serve, which was generated in the Americans' purging of the hate crime South functions, such as with school segregation. The dereliction of duty in refusing to enforce the obligation was the mechanism specifically compelling the state governments to comply with the federal order to desegregate the population, at which point the removing of that system allows them to go into historic positions where the Confederacy was a viable legal theory instead of a bunch of psychopathic racist faggots. And I don't mean faggots as in homosexual, although they are homosexual. The faggot is the fag or the bundle of sticks or the function of the Nazism as a function of a war strategy. You get a bunch of socially inferior degenerates and you bundle them together, and the fact that they are individually frail, pathetic, useless, unvaluable pieces of wood is mitigated by putting them in a clump together, at which point a violent extremist minority or terrorists becomes superior to the majority's will, at which point the threats against the general majority becomes the systematic mechanism, which is how they implemented the Nazi overthrow of Germany, which serves as a blueprint for systems that they're using through the cover of secrecy, under the color of law, protecting the secrets of their crimes against the American Republic, changing the votes, and thus engaging in treason, sedition, and high crimes by their deliberate acts of war against the Republic and its agents. These Confederate interests, such as the use of eminent domain over personhood, otherwise known as chattel slavery, otherwise known as indentured slavery, specifically barred by the Constitution, is generated under the argument that there are no rights, there are only permits, at which point the system of permits argued by people such as Ted Cruz has systematically been used in order to manipulate in secret courts the function of the existence of rights in the absolute destruction of any public order, which is systematically the functional point as hired contract or subcontract KKK functions against the United States, RICO violations, subcontracts in the United States through their surveillance and other mechanisms, such as the Sheriff's Department use of military equipment against civilians, breaking the judicial definition of the Second Amendment, defining the common weapons have to be the restraints, at which point the function of common weapons is the things used against the general public is the common weapon in question, as opposed to the function of military-grade equipment being arbitrarily available, such as nukes or tanks and something along these lines. The act of publicly normal used equipment, including these secrets, is the breach in that definition, which generates a fully arbitrary function which completely destroys the entire ruling. It is through their various frauds of color of law and color of office to engage in the targeted labeling of enemy combatant in order to remove systematic rights from target people, such as the rights of prisoners of war to receive their legitimate acknowledgement of their status in office. In the detained position, there is an obligation of a minimum level of treatment, such as David being captured as a general has to be treated under the status of the general, which is systematically violated as malicious war crimes by the Confederate anti-law insurrectionists under Lindsey Graham's Civil War orders. In order to engage in the proper understanding, there is the attacks, such as the attacks against dental, or the attacks against physical mutilation, such as brain injuries through their poisonings, through their assaults, through their surveillance technology, which they are not submitting, generates the arbitrary injury, at which point you have the defamation off of hearsay, which the hearsay is generated by the government desiring the answer, at which point the government feeds a source, and that source provides the hearsay, and the government uses its own polluted, broken chain of custody order in order to generate whatever they want, including genital mutilation, which leads to the function of genocide of their targeted groups for the systematic coercion and forced isolation of the systematic systems under the false accusations from their smear factory, generating a general state of anarchy, and thus in the arbitrary state of lawlessness, the dentists or medical personnel, such as doctors for surgery, would not be compelled to provide services to the particular people who have the rights of their physical health removed from them, which isn't just a violation of every systematic law under their own precedents, but it is the mechanism of generating a credible threat to the rest of the general community in order to engage coercion for compliance, which is the function of terrorism, at which point you have the KKK materially reborn in their resurrection of the Confederate militia. Their use of economic terrorism or war against the capitalist system generates the obstruction of contracts, which generates the seizing and freezing of accounts in order to prevent normal lawful functions, at which point the prevention of those functions by the prisoner of war function under the secrecy fraud generates the inability to pay for the medical attention required, at which point the fraudulent argument that someone can't afford it is specifically known to be wrong, at which point the government, who under those conditions of holding someone under their restraints is obligated for them to pay, for the system. If a police officer arrests you and you have an injury from the function, they have to deliver you to a medical facility, and they are liable to pay all medical costs. And the function of their fraudulent use of secrets is the subversion of them being in control and having to pay, at which point they're in control and they're extorting it as a mechanism in order to engage the forced sale of hyper-limited funds with mostly frozen accounts, generating the fraudulent argument that the frozen accounts can't be used because of the secret, when in fact it is the government itself who was liable originally to pay under those arrangements, at which point you have to purely understand the manufactured evil of these war criminal Satanist radicals threatening public security. They're defrauding the courts through their smear factory planting of false evidence. Terrorism allows for the fraudulent infinite diversity of the mechanized threat, which compels for the releasing in a due process system of the POV of the surveillance system instead of the POV of their target, at which point you can't understand what the magic trick is unless you're observing the magician and his general setup, at which point you don't understand that you're watching a magic show unless, of course, you are observing the wizard in question instead of the audience, at which point if you look at the girl inside the box while the magician is sawing it with a saw, you might think that the girl is dead because she's just sawn in half, when in reality the POV of the wizard generates the acknowledged position that it's just a trick, that it's just an illusion, that it's just entertainment or outright fraud in the case that they are trying to use it for a material advantage outside of entertainment.
And it doesn't matter how many women are affected by the abortion pill, they only care about the profit. How many adverse effects doesn't matter, just like the birth control pill. They don't care, and they won't talk about it. They won't talk about the blood clots, they won't talk about the strokes, they won't talk about any of that. We've been covering on this show how the eugenics program of the early 1900s never went away. They've simply evolved with the help of the biopharmaceutical complex to make it easier and more convenient to control the population, while at the same time Big Pharma can make trillions of dollars off of that control. The World Economic Forum and the billionaire class want population control, and they put their money where their mouth is. The company that makes the drug mifepristone is called Danco Laboratories. And many people have tried to figure out who owns this company. Good luck. Who's running the show at Danco Laboratories in Manhattan? We don't know. They're incredibly secretive about its stakeholders, but Carol Novelli has been shedding light on it, and she's been researching this deeply. She discovered the population control champion Warren Buffett is a huge funder of Danco Laboratories, and it's not surprising also on the list George Soros is another major investor. Yes, another huge fan of population control. Huge fans of the World Economic Forum and that mission. So we could keep pulling this thread, and we will, but for now, that's all I'm going to say about this, my conspiracy theory. That's all I'll say about the deep state money.
What you're implying is that the Supreme Court ruling was intentional and could have been intentionally pioneered by the biopharmaceutical complex in order to expand access of abortion through pharmaceuticals rather than abortion through
clinics,
clinical procedures,
right,
which do not actually involve a pharmaceutical usually.
Right. So the clinics, none of these doctors actually, I've seen interviews, they don't actually want to be performing these things, right? So it gets them off the hook for having to do them. The clinics then don't have to be.
Right, it also
mean exactly the same thing that the Pentagon said. Males of military age in an area that we deemed tricky. Males of military age in an area that we deemed tricky. In an area that we deemed to be filled with scalawags. So, on the days Prince Harry claims to have killed these 25, there weren't actually any fighters in that area. And then he also tweeted, the Afghan official also tweeted, "Mr. Harry, the ones you killed were not chess pieces. They were humans." Referring to Harry's description of killing enemy combatants. The truth is, what you've said, our innocent people were chess pieces to your soldiers, military, and political leaders. And said, the Western occupation of Afghanistan is truly an odious moment in human history, and comments by Prince Harry is a microcosm of the trauma experienced by Afghans at the hands of occupation forces, who murdered innocents without any accountability.
The example of the war in Afghanistan had the secret court system connecting David's character to many of the supporting personnel of Afghan civilian populations who were systematically warned of the targeting system of them for the sake of murdering Afghan civilians who were not going to be guilty of anything. So when Joe Biden made a rush to leave Afghanistan and the mass bombing happened with the Taliban's retaking of the system, generated the exact thing warned about, which isn't avoidable, as they are the soldiers in question are Confederate militia and not American loyalists, at which point these mindless terrorist insurrectionists were systematically arranging for the way in order to kill the groups even that were supporting them under that system. And when people around the United States and around the world, such as Glenn Beck and many of the others, who collected resources in order to get them to be able to be transported out, as there are many Afghan civilians who were just piling on overly much and even getting onto the plane's wings and falling to their death. They were actively blocked from evacuation by that system so that they could be killed when the Taliban retook everything. These are mindless hate group criminals, and they hate functionally everything. They are devoted, mindless Satanist creeps, and the threat that they pose against the United States by their acts of war against the American population required them to target David Bowles as General of Military Intelligence Oversight Functions to block through sedition the lawful functions and actions of that branch, which was removed in order to allow for their criminal enterprise to be conducted against the United States in the systematic wars which would be observable in the obligation of a nation of law, in an obligation to the devotion of a capitalist society, would have to protect the contract schedules of David's character, acknowledged by the secret courts, which would systematically have to release and return those functions which were barred so the damages could be viably implemented against the targeted groups that would have otherwise been safe. And the problem is that these war criminals are only going to make it worse. These damages will only exponentially ramp up. They will only increase their threat to the general public. They are a mindless Confederate terrorist organization, and murdering the innocent is what gives them viable definition. They aren't human beings with a soul. They are mindless murdering hobos. The murder hobos from D&D on crack cocaine. They're fucking the most extreme psychopathic pieces of shit history has ever been able to produce, and their wars against David Bowles are the exact in context definition of being uncontrollable, unpolluted evil.